This episode is sponsored by the Veritas Forum podcast, a podcast that puts the Christian faith into dialogue with other worldviews. This season, they're taking on life's big questions, like, does my life have meaning? Why am I so anxious? Is God real? Am I good enough? We all have moments in our lives that make us ask the big questions about meaning and purpose, about why we're here. But too often, when the moment of crisis or introspection is past, we get busy again and forget about the whole thing. Yet the questions still remain. The folks at the Veritas Forum believe now is the perfect time to answer these questions. So this season, the Veritas Forum podcast focuses on helping you think through these big questions in your life. Each week, you'll hear from top scholars from schools such as Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, and Notre Dame. So engage your heart and your mind around life's big questions. Check out the conversations on the Veritas Forum podcast. Look for the Veritas Forum podcast, that's Veritas, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Guess what day it is?
Oh-ho!
It's French Fry Day, it's French Fry Day, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Fry Day. It's French Fry Day.
Hey, David French, welcome back.
Skye, it's great to be back.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for your writing. You are now, a couple weeks into your New York Times gig?
I think as of the time that we record this, exactly 3 weeks.
Any buyer's
so
remorse?
I'm a veteran. No.
Clearly.
No. No buyer's remorse yet. It's a, as I was saying to the folks, I was just at the Times building last week, and it hit me. This is the biggest company I've worked for in my life by orders of magnitude. There
Not
are
counting
thousands,
the military.
Well, aside, of course, from the Army,
Yeah.
but company.
Sure.
There are thousands of employees. I mean, this is a huge journalistic operation. And when I first signed on to New York Times Slack and I saw more than 5,000 members, I realized, this is a tiny bit different from the Dispatch.
Right. Yeah. How big is the Dispatch? Not that you have to give away state secrets here.
Oh, Dispatch has really grown. I mean, I remember our very first meeting, there were about 6 of us around a conference table. And then now I got, I don't know exactly, 40-ish employees. So it's really grown.
My daughters just applied for an internship there for the summer. So among other things, it's an option. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. I know some people over there, Skye.
I hear you do.
Yeah.
Although maybe you're on the outs now that you've crossed over.
I still have connections.
Good to know. Okay, well, let's talk about some stuff you've written recently in the New York Times. You wrote a fantastically interesting piece called Men Need Purpose More Than Respect. This came out on February 12th. We'll link to it in the show notes. So you began by responding to Matt Walsh, a podcaster, who tweeted this rather provocative, inflammatory message. He said, all a man wants is to come home from a long day at work to a grateful wife and children who are glad to see him and a dinner cooking on the stove. This is literally all it takes to make a man happy. We are simple. Give us this and you'll have given us nearly everything we need. And you jokingly talk about it being a Leave It to Beaver vision of manhood. Right. I didn't see the tweet. I didn't see the responses, but there are probably 15 different ways you could go at this in responding to it.
Yeah.
What was your initial reaction when you came across that?
Well, there were two things. One, obviously, it was trollish. Obviously, it was designed to elicit outrage. It wasn't a serious policy proposal. There are a lot of quite conservative families where the mother and father both work and they both want to work. And so that's sort of like, hey, dad's home. Here's the grateful wife, grateful kids, food on the stove. That vision is not a program. So obviously it was trollish. But it absolutely blew up. About 18 million people viewed that one tweet. And I think it blew up not just because it was trollish, because he's quite often trollish, but I think it blew up because it really connected with this sort of sense that I talk about next in the piece, that there is this argument that I'm sure you've heard, Skye, I've heard for a long time, that what men really need is respect. And this is a sort of a concrete way of showing sort of respect or gratitude is, I'm grateful for your work when you get home, and here's your dinner, and that really echoes with that world that says what men need is respect. And I talked about this, book that sold 2+ million copies a few years ago, that men need respect and women need love. And,
as if men don't need love and women don't need respect.
Right. And now the interesting thing is, if you talk to the author of that book, I mean, he's going to say, for example, no, we need both. I mean, men need respect and they need love, but this is a push comes to shove kind of thing, that when push comes to shove, what women really want is love, and what men really want is respect. And he has some social science to back it up. This is, that if you poll men and you ask them when push comes to shove, they're going to say they choose respect over love. That when there's conflict, men feel disrespected. And this is from Emerson Eggerich's work. He wrote a book, Love and Respect, the love she most desires, the respect he desperately needs. And what I wanted to do was sort of tackle this notion, because this also plugs in a lot with sort of how we approach the root of a lot of culture war type issues, which is kind of this shame honor sort of society culture that unless I'm shown proper respect, I have a legitimate grievance. And that legitimate grievance is related to a lack of respect. And so I really wanted to plug into that and dive into that, because I think it's just misdiagnosing the problems with young men and older men in our society, that the real problem is not, in fact, a lack of respect. That is not the thing that is driving a lot of the angst and the pain that young men suffer from. And so I wanted to explore, what is the thing? What is it that is missing if it's not respect?
So before we get into the thing that is missing, most people seem to be in agreement that there is a crisis going on among American men. And
Yes.
the data is pretty stunning when you look at loneliness, depression, anxiety, suicide rates, drug abuse rates. All of those things are escalating dramatically among men. Some people are then matching that with, or combining it with, a general negative attitude that the popular culture seems to be expressing towards masculinity. We've heard the term toxic masculinity, which may compound the problem, because now you're telling men, not only are you facing all these challenges, but there's something intrinsically wrong about your core identity. And so in response to all of that, you have people like Matt Walsh and others saying, we need respect. The culture and everyone else needs to respect men. That's the problem, which on the surface sounds really appealing. And I know there's a huge audience for that message. It feels a little bit like Fredo from Godfather Part 2, where, he's like, I'm smart. I want respect. I got passed over. And, he kind of does this whole crybaby thing to Michael. But it feels a little bit like, if we really go down this road of what we ultimately need is respect, ironically, aren't we giving over too much power to other people to determine our value?
Yeah, so there's two really big problems. One is, if you're going to construct a world in which your self-conception lives in the gaze of another person, you are automatically beginning to delegate an enormous amount of sense of self to people you don't control, and to individuals who you have no ability, truly. I mean, you have maybe influence over their perception of you, but you do not control their perception of you at all. And so you're creating a situation that is inherently sort of emotionally unstable when you're talking about delegating that sense of self-worth to another person's regard. And that is dangerous just from a sort of a common sense standpoint. As close as my wife and I are, and as much as I love my wife and she loves me, the idea that sort of my day-to-day sense of worth is going to be so directly tied to how my kids respond to me, how my wife responds to me in any given moment. And that is dangerous. That is dangerous.
That's codependency in a psychological way.
And then the other thing... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, David. Before you go on to the second thing, beyond just men looking for respect, isn't this a broadly common dynamic in our culture where any identity group is looking for the broader respect of the society, which leads to really bizarre behaviors and expectations?
Yes, and this is why I brought up earlier the concept of shame-honor culture. So I've written about this in the past because it's particularly salient in the South, where I grew up. The South is sort of the regional home of American shame-honor culture. And so what is shame-honor culture? Shame-honor culture is a culture in which your own self-worth or your own sense of self is at least to a high degree dependent on how much respect others give you. And a lot of what people who come from outside the South look and see in the South is, look how mannerly everyone is, right? Look how nice everyone is. Well, that's one way in which shame-honor cultures manifest themselves. There's sort of the sort of sense of, well, in every circumstance, I am to be respectful because respect is demanded. You also see this in the Middle East, where there's this incredible sense of hospitality. There's when you meet people, often there's this sense of deference and respectfulness. And a lot of this can come across as quite good. Like, hey, people are nice to each other in the South. But the problem is if it is sort of in the atmosphere of you're nice or else. And, this is something, that is the dark side of it. That's why a lot of people who grew up in the South will say, yeah, we've got manners, but it's not quite what you think it is.
My father's side of the family is from India. He's an immigrant from India. In traditional Indian culture, there's a lot of deference given to the oldest patriarch in the household, right? The father or the grandfather, whatever. And you go into some of those households and the expectation is that you bow and touch the feet of this patriarch. And the Hindi word is pedapao, which means touch my feet. And my mother's American and my dad, it was kind of like Lucy and Ricky in our home a little bit, the foreigner and the kind of crazy redhead. But my dad taught our dog when I was a boy that when my dad would come in the house, the dog would bow and touch my dad's feet. Because it was the most respect he could get in the household. But it was a little bit like the dog didn't do it because he genuinely respected my dad. He did it because it was just the expectation of what you do. So you create these structures of honor, but because they're so structured and expected, in a weird sense, they lose their honorific value.
Yes, they do. And what ends up happening is the honor becomes a sense of entitlement. So it's not even appreciated. Right. It is mandatory. And so when the honor becomes a sense of entitlement, it's not valued, but if it's missing, the absence is really, really felt. And so it becomes a series of formalities. And so, on the one, again, going back to my upbringing, I appreciate that kids tend to use sir and ma'am around here. I appreciate that. I think that's a good habit as a general matter. But at the same time, I think if you are immediately prickly, for example, if someone slips up or does not show the kind of respect that you are accustomed to in your culture, then that's when you begin to see some of the dark side of this all. And there's this book that in a previous piece I quoted called by a Kent State professor named Gary Cubia, who said that honor meant that Southerners beheld themselves as others beheld them. And again, that is a real problem. So you start to take for granted being honored as an absolute entitlement. And so then the real emotion comes when you're deprived of what you demand.
Okay, now, before we get into the prescribed solution that you have, an awful lot of American evangelical culture has been deeply influenced by Southern culture.
Yes.
Do you think, is that where a lot of the Christian rhetoric around male respect and patriarchy is coming from in this conversation?
Yeah, I wrote a piece more than a year ago called "Where Does the South End and Where Does Christianity Begin?" Because it is absolutely the case that American Christianity is practicing Christianity is disproportionately Southern. I mean, that's just completely obvious. This is where the states where you have a disproportionate number of people who go to church, your ministries disproportionately located in the South. And so obviously American evangelical culture is going to be disproportionately influenced by American Southern culture. And which is unfortunate in some ways, because if I was going to pick sort of a region of the South to sort of represent American Christianity colored by its cultural influences, I was born in Alabama, raised in Louisiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So I'm talking about my own region here. There are elements of Southern culture that are really a problem, And when I wrote my piece, and this is some time ago, I kind of walked through what you see in a very interesting way, in which even leading Christians who are ministry leaders, who have huge platforms, have really imbibed this sense of, if you come against us, we'll come against you. And that's part of that shame honor culture.
Well, I mean, every culture has elements that are congruent with God's character and the vision he has for his people, and there are parts that are incongruent. The hard part is discerning what's the difference.
Yes, exactly.
But it seems like what's happened is this Southern shame honor-based thing, especially as it relates to masculinity, we have taken that as biblical mandate rather than culturally influenced expectation, which is where then you get into so much of this rhetoric in men's ministries and books written for men in the church around respect. There's a degree to which that's great. Like we are called to honor our fathers. We're to treat older men as fathers and younger men as brothers in the church. And there is that shame honor-based thing in ancient cultures as well. And there's some good in that. But when we take it to the extreme, it does get really weird and bizarre. But back to your point, this idea of externalizing our value based on how other people respond to us is inherently fragile. So what's the better option?
Yes. So it's not only fragile, it also causes, when somebody is not respectable but demands respect, then they're often subjugating others. They're often oppressing and tyrannizing others. So the alternative is virtuous purpose. The alternative to respect is purpose. And what I wanted to be very clear to say was virtuous purpose. And the reason I thought of this is because of my military experience. Because if you want to take a look at a community of people who are covered up with respect in this culture, both national respect, familial respect, it's America's veterans. And yet America's veterans still deal with a lot of the maladies of deaths of despair, higher suicide rates, for example, than the general public. And now part of this can be explained by the trauma of combat, but it cannot be entirely explained by that. And I talked about how critical it is, if you're talking to veterans groups and you're talking about struggling veterans, the one thing they are not saying is give us more respect. Right.
That was a refrain you may have heard following the Vietnam War, where there was a lot of disunity and a lot of disrespect to soldiers. But there seems like when I was in high school and the first Iraq War was happening, there was this very deliberate effort to not repeat the mistakes of the Vietnam era. And just the other day, I was sitting at an airport terminal waiting for my flight, and a plane pulled in with a soldier returning home, and they had the water cannons out there. There was balloons and decorations. And I mean, the whole terminal came to a halt to applaud this young man who was coming home. And so you're right, when you talk about honoring people, it's hard to identify people who are more respected and honored right now in our culture than military folks, veterans. And so it's not a lack of honor that's plaguing our military veterans, and yet they're facing really, really significant challenges.
Yes, exactly. I mean, when I came back, and I talked about this in my piece, when I left my base and I was coming home to see my wife and kids, which is a wonderful, joyous thing, I had this incredible sense and shocking sense of emptiness right after I left the base that I had been stationed for almost a year in eastern Diyala province during the surge. Just this unbelievable sense of emptiness. It took me by surprise. It was awful. And it took me a long time to sort of sort out why that happened. And I realized was that all at once, in one 12-hour span, from the moment I got on the transport plane to leave Balad Air Base in Iraq to land in Kuwait to get ready to get on a civilian charter flight to fly back, I lost my mission and I lost my brotherhood all at once. And although I'm still, of course, very close to the guys I served with, we were in daily communication, it's not the same. It's not the same as it was there. And although I was able to replace my lost purpose with the purpose of being a husband and a father and the purpose of my legal work defending civil liberties and religious freedom, the intensity of the sense of purpose you feel in a combat zone is so difficult to replicate. So all at once you lose a purpose and a fellowship. And it's one of the reasons why veterans groups constantly use terms like next mission to describe how veterans should be thinking about their lives, because this is a community of people who are used to having a mission. And then when they're discharged from the military, they don't have that mission anymore. And so while they have respect, and you see it across generations now, you've got the old guy who's got the Korean War veteran hat on, and people are going to thank him, or the Vietnam veteran hat. And I keep wondering, am I old enough at mid-50s to start wearing a veteran hat myself, because it seems like only the older guys do that. And you're constantly thanked. People are constantly appreciative. Family members appreciate it. And yet, again, without that sense of virtuous purpose, people feel lost.
When I was a seminary student, I spent a semester as a hospital chaplain in chaplaincy training. And one of the more disturbing parts of that experience was the realization in the training around the fact that suicide rates are highest among the elderly. And when you really get into the reason why, it's exactly what you're describing. The process of aging is the loss of one purpose after another, or one sense of meaning after another. You may lose a spouse, you lose your career, you lose your physical mobility or capacities of things you used to love to do. You feel less and less like you're contributing to some greater purpose. And when that loss really sets in, taking one's life becomes a thought that finds traction. And I imagine that's part of what's going on with the suicide rate among veterans, where in a combat situation or even non-combat situation, your mission is so clear and so acute, and it's so hard to replicate that kind of clarity in the civilian world. So it's not just the loss of honor, it's the loss of meaning and purpose. All right, here's a weird connection.
Okay.
Did you listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast that CT put out?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that came out really clearly in the early episodes where they're describing the rise of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll's ministry was his strong effectiveness at reaching wayward young men who were struggling a lot. And they found in Mark somebody who was maybe a surrogate father figure, but he also managed to give them a very clear sense of purpose.
Yes.
Now, that ended up becoming abusive and destructive and toxic later on. But what's a healthy versus an unhealthy way of restoring this idea of purpose? Because I don't want to just say, people find purpose and go somewhere, because I've seen it abused in some pretty nasty ways. Yeah. So what's a healthy way that's represented?
That's a great question, because, Mark Driscoll has been replaced by some secular figures, an Andrew Tate, for example, Jordan Peterson, for example. And so here's what I would say can be healthy. And a lot of people won't like to hear this, but I do believe it can be healthy. Sometimes you gotta grab a young man by his lapels and say, snap out of it. What are you doing? Right? There are entire categories of young men who respond. They just need somebody to sort of say, what is going on? Mm-hmm. You shape up. This is the classic example of the drill sergeant, right? You go to boot camp and it's one long exercise and snap out of it, shape up, get your act together. And, we would love it if it was a world where everyone could put their arm gently around another person and say, love you, appreciate you. There's so many wonderful qualities about you, but I really wish you'd try to get a job. Some people respond fine to that. Some people respond to get a freaking job. And so
you have 2 days, otherwise pack up. Something
right,
like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think that we can look at a attitude of sort of harshness or aggressiveness and say that is de facto bad, because that is how you reach a lot of young men. But here's the but. If you kept listening to some of the Mark Driscoll stuff, and if you keep listening to some of the Andrew Tate things. So Andrew Tate's a guy, for those who don't know, I believe, who's former MMA fighter, kickboxer, who has a huge following of young boys, of young men and boys, where he's got wealth and he has the best cars. He's always on private planes. He's always got beautiful women. He kind of has this eclectic mix of advocating for stoicism, garden variety, sort of self-help, motivational speaker kind of, pablum, and then a giant dose of like entitled misogyny. So all of those things are together. And so a lot of the boys are drawn to, for example, hey, Andrew Tate or somebody says, read Marcus Aurelius. And so you go and you read like this classical Stoic thinker or whatever. And then also what they say is everyone's against you. He uses a term like the Matrix or whatever to describe the world that's against boys and against men. And Driscoll mixed this sort of, hey, snap out of it also with, if you remember, some really toxic advice and instructions about, like, for example, what was the term used? I can't remember if this is exactly it. Smoking hot wife theology.
Yeah.
That your wife is your porn star kind of thing, that, and which is entitlement. That's entitlement.
Right.
And so there was this incredible mixed message. On one hand, it was take responsibility. And then on the other hand, it was also feeding a sense of entitlement. And it's that sense of entitlement and grievance that begins to be such a profound problem.
This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Miracle Made. Hey, we have a new sponsor here on The Holy Post. Did you know that your temperature at night can have one of the greatest impacts on your sleep quality? If you wake up too hot or too cold, you need to check out Miracle Made's bed sheets, inspired by silver-infused fabrics made by NASA. That's right, it's rocket science. Miracle Made makes temperature-regulating bedding so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. Go to trymiracle.com/holypost to try it today. And we have a special deal for our listeners. Save over 40%, plus use our promo code HOLYPOST at checkout to save even more and get 3 free towels. Free towels! That's pretty great! Miracle Made sheets come with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/holypost and use the code HOLYPOST to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/holypost to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets, diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode.
So, talking more broadly than the church, why do you think we are seeing this crisis of masculinity in our society? How has American society been structured in a way where fewer and fewer men are finding that sense of purpose?
Yeah.
Is there something you can point to that goes, oh, that's where it began, or this is the problem?
Yeah, so I think this is pre-ideological in the sense that a lot of people look at the problems of masculinity will say, well, it's because of the feminist movement and the introduction of the term of toxic masculinity, or people on the right, people on the left will say, well, it's because of traditional masculinity ideology. And so there's a lot of ideological explanations for the struggle of men. I think it is much deeper than that. I think it is a pre-ideological problem that's exacerbated by ideology. And here's what I mean. For generation upon generation upon generation, there was a kind of a path of life, a way of life itself was difficult enough. And when I say difficult enough, I mean even just physically difficult enough that a man didn't have to sit around and go, what does it mean to be a man? He got up and he hitched a plow to the oxen and he got to work. Or as the Industrial Revolution arrived, factories were automated, but a lot of that was brutal work. So you had a combination of both working conditions and plus outright discrimination that kept women in workspaces. And so you had this glide path where a typical guy didn't have to wake up in the morning and say, what does it mean to be a guy? You had to wake up in the morning with aching muscles and get up and do what he did before, that in many circumstances, men were uniquely qualified to do to sort of sustain society and government and civilization. I mean, if you look back at the military 40, 50 years ago was much larger relative to the population than it is now and much more heavily male. And so you had all of these through a combination of just life circumstances and outright discrimination. You had glide paths for men.
Yeah, in an economy and society that function through physical labor, men had a natural advantage.
Exactly.
And as we've gotten further and further away from that, and the economy runs more on moving pixels around screens, physical strength is not a factor.
Yeah. So, you have a removal of outright discrimination against women, which is good, which is necessary for justice. And so you remove the discrimination artificially that was artificially suppressing women's advancement. And then at the same time, the nature of work changes itself to where there's nothing inherently sort of masculine about being in a cubicle, right? There's nothing inherently masculine about what you do on a keyboard. Now, some people try to substitute that by, sort of saying their extremely aggressive typing is inherently masculine, but there's nothing inherently masculine about that. So you have this really good development, which is equality under the law with women. And this development that I'm not going to say it's good or bad, it just is. It's like the weather. It's like the changing, the sun rising. It's this fundamental change in technology that makes that sort of extreme physical exertion less and less and less necessary every, any given year. And so all of a sudden, all of those pathways that were huge, that were wide, that were in many ways either male exclusive or disproportionately male, just aren't there anymore. And that's a giant civilizational change. And so you'll see what I mean by sort of pre-ideological, unless somebody's want to say, well, it's inherently ideological that we that we granted women equality under the law. I would call that constitutional. But yeah, there's a giant change, which is naturally going to create an enormous amount of turmoil. And then here comes ideology, to try to fix it.
So I read a book years ago when I was researching a book I was writing about the intersection of Christianity and consumerism, but the book was called Consumed by Benjamin Barber. And he talks about the rise of consumer culture in America. And one of the premises of that book was that in order for consumerism to really thrive, you have to make children behave like adults and you have to make adults behave like children. And what he meant by that is you need to make children empowered to make purchasing decisions for a household. But then you need adults to no longer act responsibly, rationally, or for the sake of others, but based on their appetites and desires. So they will make irrational decisions with their money. And anyway, the larger argument of this whole book is that consumerism basically infantilizes adults. It makes us immature and retards normal maturing. That's why you get prolonged adolescence. You get a lot of the habits that you see in younger men today look so different than a few generations ago, where fewer of them have jobs or are living independently or getting married or raising families, all that, because we've delayed adulthood. And his argument, it's really rooted in the messaging of a consumer culture that's always telling us life's about your desires. It's not about sacrifice. It's not about giving up yourself for the sake of others. Your article's all saying the opposite, which is for men to feel a sense of self-worth and dignity, we need to surrender our desires and goals in order to do something meaningful for someone else. So is part of this also just the headwaters of a consumer culture that we marinate in from the time we're born, telling us it's all about you and your desires. And so then we do that and we feel unsatisfied by it.
Yes, that's a tremendous point, because here's what's happened is you take a world in which you had an enormous sense of purpose just in making it possible to live, right? There was to live, to defend a civilization, et cetera, et cetera.
The cliche of providing bread on the table.
Right, exactly. The most basic of things. And then you say, okay, well, you don't really, here's the substitute for that. Stuff. Like, you don't really have to worry about can you live anymore. But now you have a substitute purpose, the accumulation of things. And the next cool thing, the next car, the next vacation, etc. And then for a while, I'm not going to pretend that for a while that doesn't actually motivate people. It does. I mean, there's an
assuming they can achieve it.
Right. There's an enormous motivator in economic prosperity. It's a motivator, but it's not a fulfiller, because what ends up happening is you often get exactly what you wanted and you still feel incredible emptiness. And so we have substituted this path that says, here's the brutal reality of life. If you want to live, it's going to be hard. And then we say, now luxury the better reality of life. You can live and it can be luxury. But luxury luxury can corrode the soul, not just fulfill the soul. It can corrode the soul. It won't. And so we've given then a consumerist culture an alternative, which is the accumulation of things and success in the eyes of the world. Back to the respect point. I'm a super successful entrepreneur. I'm whatever it is. So we tell people they can have stuff and respect, and they get the stuff and maybe they get the respect, and yet there's still this emptiness.
So but before we wrap up this bit of the conversation, when I read your piece, it struck me because I've been having really interesting conversations with my 18-year-old son. He's a senior in high school. He's about to make a decision about what college or university he's going to attend next year. And I can tell it's causing some angst in him, because I think for the first time in his life, he realizes he's making an important decision, and whatever school he chooses to go to, there are thousands he's choosing not to go to, and he's worried about buyer's remorse or regretting the decision. And so it's opened up the door to multiple conversations about what does it mean to get older, what does it mean to make decisions, and how do you live with contentment in those decisions rather than always second guessing, well, I could have done this or done that. And for our conversations, it's turned into this much broader topic of, as somebody who's 47, I've learned that I find the most meaning and significance by the limitations that are on my life. by the fact that I am only married to this one woman, the fact that I have these children, the fact that I have this work that's been given me to do. And I could spend all day thinking about, well, what if I'd married that person, or if I'd chosen this career or gone to that school instead? But there's something very comforting in choosing what you didn't choose, or learning to choose the life that you currently have and finding meaning and purpose in that, rather than constantly be tormented by all the things I didn't choose. And for an 18-year-old, it's a new concept for him to kind of deal with that. But it's a little bit, I think, what you're talking about is, what does it mean to find purpose where you are, rather than respect from something you don't yet have?
Well, and one thing that I have said many times is, if you're looking for, and I do think there is such a thing as sort of, what is your purpose as a man? Like, what is your purpose as a man? That is a real thing that people think about. And you can't shake them. You can't just say, well, don't think about like your purpose as a man. That is something that is what I've thought about throughout much of my life. It's what young men think about. And one of the things I think that's really important is to remind people, only a man can be a husband, only a man can be a father, and any man can be a friend. Okay? And so these three core relationships, husband, father, friend, all of these are the relationships that are under extreme strain right now in our culture. We have declining marriage rates, you have high levels of fatherlessness, and you have declining amounts of friendships. And my advice is, if you center your purpose around being in, now, not everybody can have all three of these relationships, right? But I would say virtually any man can have at least one, the friendship relationship. And if you center your life around loving and serving these people who are in relationship with you, whether a wife, a son or a daughter, a friend, a lot of what you would call stereotypically masculine purpose flows out of that. So if you are a friend, if you're a husband, if a father, there will be occasions in your life when you must demonstrate courage. To be a good husband, you're going to have to show courage. To be a good friend, you're going to have to show courage. There will be times when you'll have to show strength. There will be times when, but it's all in the context of what does it mean to be to be a good husband, a good father, a good friend. And those are very attainable, even if the idea that, well, not everyone can join the infantry, and not everyone's going to work with their hands creating, industrial marvels, but you can be a husband, you can be a father, you can be a friend, and that's what's rich, and that's what's profound. And, I was talking to somebody about this column at the Times last week, and I was like, you can gain the New York Times, a really cool, job, you can get a really cool job. You can gain the New York Times, but if you lose your family, what have you really gained, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I would say for talking to young men. Only a man can be a husband. Only a man can be a father. Any man can be a friend. And when you center around that virtuous purpose, I think you are looking at something a lot more deeply, profoundly meaningful at every age, by the way, because only a man can be a grandfather. Only a man can be a great-grandfather. That can provide immense source of meaning for a lifetime.
Okay, let's move on to something completely different. We've talked about it a few times, but things keep changing, and that's the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We are recording this on the Tuesday after President's Day, which we all woke up to discover that President Biden was in Kiev and meeting with Zelensky in a somewhat perilous decision of his to go to the war zone. There's been a lot of buzz about that. He also committed to more support from the United States for the effort against the Russian invasion. You wrote a piece just a few days earlier about the evidence that the support of the United States may be waffling a little bit for Ukraine. So talk about, we're a year into this. Where do you see the United States, either the government policy, the Biden administration policy, but then where do you see the country as a whole in our commitment to Ukraine, and are you concerned?
Yeah, so let's split these in two. First, let's talk about Biden. I'm mostly very happy with the way Biden has responded to the Russian invasion. I was just in a meeting with a senior Pentagon official who described the immediate reaction the American government had to providing vast amounts of weapons that were exactly the weapons needed to win the Battle of Kyiv at the start of the war, exactly the weapons needed to respond to the second phase of the war. Now they're intentionally thinking through what are the weapons needed for this third phase of the war, which might include very substantial Russian mobilization that has to be countered, not by Ukraine has far fewer people than Russia does. It has to be countered by technology with the possibility of sufficient arms and high enough quality arms to roll back Russian advances. And so the Biden administration has a lot of really difficult strategic choices to make, and I'm urging them to err on the side of providing Ukraine with the weapons it needs to drive the Russians at least to the start line of the war, so that they are driven out back to the lines where the war started, if not beyond that, to drive them entirely out of Ukraine. And so I'm mostly happy, although I think there have been some slow decisions and maybe not sufficient numbers of advanced weapons that are gone to Ukraine. But I'm mostly happy with the way the Biden administration has responded.
So there's been a moving, I don't know what the right word is, but originally after the initial invasion, NATO countries, the United States included, said that they would support Ukraine with defensive equipment only. And then that has slowly shifted further and further. And a few weeks ago, Germany and the United States committed to giving them tanks. And Zelensky is now asking for combat fighters.
Yeah.
And the question is, and in response to all these moves, Vladimir Putin has basically accused the West of an aggressive posture towards Russia, and he's using this to justify more extreme measures on his side, whether it's recruiting more people and using mercenaries in the fighting. He's constantly saber rattling that he's going to use nuclear weapons. He's suspended the START treaty. What do you say to those who would argue we're being unnecessarily provocative by engaging in more offensive weaponry? I'm not saying I buy that argument, but what's the case for offering more and more of these kinds of weapon systems to Ukraine?
So here's a core problem that we have. And the core problem is, if you have a nuclear armed power, Russia, North Korea, China, and we capitulate to nuclear saber rattling, when the nuclear armed power launches an aggressive war, an aggressive invasion of a neighbor, what you're going to do is you're going to create a one-way ratchet towards conflict and towards aggression by nuclear armed adversaries. So essentially the lesson is going to be very clear, which is we can strike, and we can strike by, as Russia did, with full, invasion of territory designed to essentially destroy the sovereignty of a foreign country, comprehensive attacks on civilian infrastructure. This was not a limited war that Russia launched. So Russia can go all in. And if the allies of the country you invade say, we're going to give you sufficient weaponry to take back what was taken from you, then we're going to rattle the nuclear saber so that every advance we get, each advance is we lock it in every new step. And what that does is it creates incentives for armed conflict. It creates an incentive for a nuclear armed power to adjust international borders through force of arms, or to gain natural resources by force of arms. And military conflict is inherently destabilizing. So you're talking about a situation where by any time Putin rattles a nuclear saber, if you back off, then what happens is you're incentivizing offensive military operations and you're incentivizing nuclear threats. That's what you're incentivizing. That is not a stabilizing position.
Yeah, it's a little bit like negotiating with a terrorist or paying a ransom for a kidnapping.
Right.
You are incentivizing the behavior rather than ending it.
And you're incentivizing it right until the point where the dictator goes too far, and there's no choice but to respond militarily. and then you find yourself in this shooting war with a nuclear armed power. The counter argument actually comes from decades of experience in the Cold War. So this was an argument, Skye. This is not a new argument. In the Cold War, we had this constant back and forth over how aggressive are you going to be in confronting Soviet expansionism. And so we early on settled on a strategy of containment, which you would describe as sort of like this far and no further. And this far and no further, containment meant that, we're going to respond in a way that tries to prevent Soviet expansion. But we're not going to try to roll back the consequences or roll back the effects of Soviet aggression. And so containment was a strategy for a long time. And it was overall pretty darn effective. But what we learned later in the Cold War is that you could actually put the Soviet Union under a greater degree of pressure. And so the reality is that by sort of saying, you get what you can take, and we won't try to take it back, you're incentivizing taking, and you're forgetting some of the lessons of the Cold War, which is, quite frankly, that the idea that Vladimir Putin would nuke parts of the West or Ukraine to preserve a toehold in the Donbass isn't really a realistic option for him. It's not really a realistic option for him. And so therefore, this idea that you're going to sort of acquiesce to Russian aggression because of nuclear saber rattling that is bluffing is deeply destructive and harmful. And if there's no risk-free path forward, let's just be very clear, because a lot of people will say, well, confronting Russia is riskier than not confronting Russia. I disagree with that. And there are risks both directions. But when you're taking a risk that deters and defeats aggression, as opposed to taking a risk that acquiesces in aggression, I think it's better to deter and defeat than acquiesce.
Right. I mean, okay, two things. One, I concur with your argument completely, but it doesn't take into account the possibility of a mad actor, meaning
right.
Has Putin lost his marbles? Maybe he's not going to act rationally, and he will do something completely ridiculously stupid and evil, in which case, how do you begin to negotiate, or not negotiate, but game out what an irrational actor may or may not do? Are we at that place, or do you think there's enough evidence that he's rationally knows what he's doing?
I don't think there's any evidence really that he's an irrational actor. I think there is a lot of evidence that he operated under deeply, deeply flawed intelligence. So, in other words, he was operating under the presumption that when he invaded Ukraine, that this was going to be a very, very short campaign. Right. Ukraine was not going to resist strongly. And one of the ways you could see that is, while you say, oh, he invaded with 180,000 troops, by historical standards, that's not a huge invasion force against a country, the largest country, I believe, that's entirely in Europe, that has a 40+ million population, that has a military of hundreds of thousands of troops on its own, that is well trained, that was intact. They attacked on 4 or 5 different lines of advance. So you took your 180,000 and you split them up, which is something you're going to do when you're expecting not that much resistance. So what he did was rational within the worldview and information set he was obviously working from. And so I don't think of him as a madman.
Okay, so bringing it back to the American home front, a year ago when this invasion first occurred, there was very, very strong support for Ukraine among the American people. It has since waned somewhat, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on why. But before we get to that, there's a part of your article about this that I found both entertaining and very disturbing, where you talk about prominent right-wing voices in America that seem to be carrying some water for Putin, if not just critical of Ukraine. Here's what you wrote. When President Zelensky of Ukraine addressed Congress last December, Tucker Carlson of Fox News derided Zelensky for wearing fatigues in the Capitol, saying he dressed like a manager of a strip club. The popular right-wing podcaster Candace Owens said, "I just want to punch him," in response to a video of Zelensky thanking Americans for their support. Not to be outdone, Donald Trump Jr. called Zelensky an international welfare queen. Why are these MAGA right voices so against American support of Ukraine?
Oh, it's multi-layered, Skye. So here's one reason, and that is going back to the Trump era. There was, if you're deep into MAGA, mythology, then what you're going to know is that there was a line of thinking that said the real villain in the Russia, all of the controversy over Russia and the alleged Russian help or alleged Russian desire for Trump to win and not Hillary, and that Russia hacking DNC servers, Russia through WikiLeaks using a reliable outlet like for its purposes, like WikiLeaks to publish that, WikiLeaks publishing that information, that the real villain there was Ukraine. And you find out some of this if you go back to first impeachment. If you remember, Trump had two demands of Zelensky. Demand number one was to investigate Hunter Biden. Right. Demand number two was to produce a server in Ukraine that is allegedly sort of the root of all the Russiagate evil. It was a server in Ukraine. So this is deep MAGA conspiracy theory stuff. Then but you add on...
Sorry, is it just coincidence that the MAGA conspiracy stuff always makes Putin and Russia out to be an innocent bystander or perhaps even a victim of someone else's nefarious work? Like, it seems odd to me that it never paints Russia or Putin in any negative light.
Well, that's getting us to the other thing. So you have the MAGA. Okay. So you have the MAGA universe that sort of disbelieves a lot of the rhetoric or disbelieves a lot of the evidence that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, calls that Russia hoax, right? Believes that Ukraine is deeply corrupt and in bed with the Bidens. And then let's layer on an additional part on top of this, which is that Russia is the muscular Christianity, the muscular Christian civilization opposing the woke West, okay? That Vladimir Putin is an anti-woke Christian leader. And so I don't know if you saw some of this guy before the war started, where people like Ted Cruz and others would share the difference between an American recruiting ad and a Russian recruiting ad for their military. And the Russian recruiting ad was like this shaved, heavily muscled guy doing all of these, parachuting out of airplanes, shooting weapons, doing push-ups, whatever it is, where he's aggressive and he's hardened, battle-hardened apparently. And then you had one taking some cartoons from TikTok, sort of talking about how, hey, if you're a kid of a same-sex couple, you can find a home in the military, and said, look, we're so woke, we're advertising with cartoons on TikTok, they're so hardened and masculine that look at the contrast, as if these cartoons were the only ways we advertise for the military, which of course they're not. And then all of a sudden the invasion happens, and all of that narrative is just blown up. It's just wiped out. The Ukrainian military, which was more westernized than the Russian military, fights like lions. The Russian military appears to be incompetent, cowardly, brutal. And so all of a sudden, this view of Vladimir Putin, Christian defender of Christian civilization and masculinity and core civilizational values against the weak, woke West, just starts to come apart. And a lot of the right is, however, still committed to this idea that the woke West is weak in comparison, and that Ukraine is corrupt. So you have the corruption of Ukraine, the weakness of the woke West, and what you're seeing is a clash that is not going the way a lot of the right-wing critics of Western civilization expected that it would go.
Okay, so obviously I'm too young to remember from my own experience the cultural dynamics during the Vietnam conflict. However, in my study of that and the great Ken Burns documentary and other things from that era, like one of the things you know from that era is that there were a lot of voices in the United States who are heavily critical of the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia.
Sure.
To the point of actually hoping for the U.S. to be defeated and humiliated in that conflict, which
Yes.
was seen by others as a deep betrayal. Even if you disagreed with the politics of the war or the justification of the war, there was still a sense of, hey, those are our sons and daughters over there.
Yes.
And we need to have some kind of unified American solidarity around this whole thing. And it was typically people on the far left or who were more progressive who were accused of having that posture towards the Vietnam conflict. How weird is it that it's now the extreme right that is, in a weird way, almost cheering for the downfall of the United States and its military interests because they think we're too weak and woke and emasculated? It just blows my mind that that's now coming from the far right when the far right used to accuse the far left of being anti-American in its posture and rhetoric.
So two things. One, I want to clarify. One is, I am not saying that everybody who's opposed to Ukraine aid is buying into that narrative that I just discussed.
Okay.
There is a very smart case that what I just explained to you about nuclear provocation is just wrong. That it's actually too dangerous to seek to defeat Putin. And this is a debatable point. I come down on the other side. But this is not what you're talking about when Candace Owens is saying she wants to punch him. Right.
Right.
Okay. So what I think it's really important for folks to understand is a large segment of the new right really doesn't like the United States that exists. They really don't like it. In much the way when I first went to law school and I encountered the far left for the very first time in my life, I was shocked. They didn't even like this country.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about far left folks. Well, if you listen to the rhetoric of a lot of people on the new right, they have a loathing for our current civilization.
Right.
They want to see it get a comeuppance. They don't believe that their political project necessarily can succeed unless we get a comeuppance. And so they really do strongly dislike the America that is. And this is some of the telltale signs are when you hear words like the real America, for example, which implies that a whole chunk of America is not real America somehow. And so there is a cohort of people, especially on the right, that look at the United States as it exists in 2023, and they, quite frankly, really hate what they see. And they share Putin's critique of our culture.
Which just is, like I said, just mind-boggling that that's how far things have gotten. Last question before we go. We are in the very, very, very early phases of the next election cycle with, well, I think only Donald Trump so far and Nikki Haley having officially declared for president. Biden, by all accounts, is likely to run again. There's no evidence that he's going to be challenged by anybody in his party. We may have a huge lineup of Republicans. We don't know yet if Donald Trump will make it to the primaries because he could be indicted and arrested and behind bars. My question is this: does Ukraine play a role in the presidential election, or is this just such a sideshow for most Americans? It's not culture war centric. It's not about domestic inflation and other economic factors. Do you think this is going to be a factor? And the reason I ask is, like you, I also believe the United States has a very significant role to play here.
Yeah.
But if there isn't support from the American public, a future administration, whether Biden or someone else, may feel the political pressure to pull back.
So I'm going to say yes on two in both phases, both the primary and the general election. So the primary, you're already, if you took at Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, you have a difference over Ukraine. Nikki Haley may not be willing to directly confront Donald Trump yet, but she absolutely has a different view of Ukraine than Trump does. to the extent that we know where DeSantis is, he came out earlier this week and said some things about the idea that Russia is some sort of threat to roll through NATO is fictional. Talked about no blank check, for example, but he hasn't really come out and yet staked out his ground. But there's going to be a big difference, and there already is a big difference between Republicans in dealing with Ukraine in the primary. And that is going to be a topic of disagreement. How important it will be will depend a lot on events, Right. Then moving into the general election, if, say, a Trump or a DeSantis wins, you're likely going to have a world in which the Democratic candidate for president is going to be substantially more hawkish in confronting Russian aggression than the Republican candidate for president. Now, if you told 1984 David that, I would have thought you've lost your mind. Right. That is not the way this works. But if a Trump or perhaps a DeSantis, we'll see where he lands, comes out of the primary, you're likely going to have more hawkishness from the Democrat than the Republican, which is mind-blowing. But if a Nikki Haley wins, you might see things revert to the older formulation where Nikki Haley will be more hawkish than Joe Biden. And so in both instances, you will see a distinction between the Republican and the Democrat.
So it used to be, you use the word hawkish a lot, and we used to talk about political parties as being hawkish or dovish.
Right.
Right. More aggressive or more passive, perhaps, on the military front. I'm not sure those categories really apply anymore, because it doesn't feel to me like the difference between a Biden and a Trump or a Biden and DeSantis is hawkish and dovish. It feels more like the difference between serious and unserious.
Right. Well, when it comes to like the Candace, Donald Trump Jr., like that Tucker world, that's just unserious stuff.
Right.
Right. It's unserious. And you would see out of Trump a lot of just unseriousness. You would not see that out of DeSantis. DeSantis is going to make concrete arguments for his position. Now, I'm probably going to disagree with it. I think that DeSantis is going to end up far more accommodating towards Russian aggression than I would want him to be. But DeSantis is going to come in with a bunch of reasons for his position, and that are going to not necessarily be rooted in the greater MAGA extended universe of conspiracy theories.
I hope not. But
I'm willing to be. I could be wrong, but I do think that the interesting thing though is if you look at the world more broadly. If you rewind the clock to summer of 2021, when Biden yanked completely out of Afghanistan, I was very upset by that. I was very much opposed to that. But he was actually slower to pull out than Trump wanted to be. Trump wanted to be out sooner. So both of them were doves. It was just that Biden did what Trump said he was going to do. But if you broaden out and you look at the pivot of American forces to the Pacific, the continued support for Ukraine, things like the CHIPS Act, the AUKUS agreement with Australia receiving is going to eventually have a nuclear submarine fleet, not nuclear armed, but nuclear submarines. It's hard to sort of say that Biden has been dovish when it comes to great power competition. In fact, he's been pretty darn aggressive, and a lot of the Republicans are less aggressive than Joe Biden. And again, a lot of this comes back to we are in a weird sort of political realignment now.
Yeah, and even his rhetoric around Taiwan has surprised a lot of people. So
absolutely,
it is a bizarro world where the Democratic president is more hawkish than the Republican Party on all these fronts. So, David, thank you again for your time, for your thoughtfulness, for your writing. We'll be linking to these two articles in our show notes, and we will catch you again next month for another French Friday.
Well, thanks so much, Skye. It's fun as always.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.